Hey everyone, this is a new video. Apologies again for the lack of content or the lack of content being uploaded. YouTube isn't my full-time job. I'm doing this in between actual work and life, so unfortunately videos are few and far between, so apologies for me not posting a video in due course. I do have many other video ideas in the pipeline, so unless you have any other interesting video ideas for me to do, please comment them below and I will gladly either talk about them or do research, obviously make a video about them to the best of my abilities and all that stuff, good stuff. But this I'm showing you is a pocket watch, and it's a very interesting pocket watch because this is the first of its kind I've ever, move that out of the way, sorry, that I've ever found. Now, cast your minds back to the First World War. Pocket watches during the Victorian era, I'm going to zoom in on the face, show. Pocket watches during the Victorian era were a very common timepiece. They'd been around since I'm trying to remember now, sorry. Around the Stuart era, they were, like the vest, they were created by the English to do over the French in fashion, or the waistcoat, I should say. And the pocket watch became a very popular timekeeping method, or timepiece, because it was basically, instead of walking through a town centre and looking at a clock on the church, you could just pull this out of your pocket and be able to tell the time instantly. Now, depending on your wealth and your status in life, you could have different types. You could have gold watches, later on brass watches, silver watches, this, that, and the other. And the way that in the latter Victorian era that was used to keep them from falling out of your pocket was what was known as a watch chain. Now, these varied in length and they varied in size and style. You most commonly see this type, which is a single Albert chain. I think it's named after the actual inventor of the chain. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know. But yeah, it's basically a small chain that loops to the ring on top of the watch, and it's held in place by what's called a T-bar, simply because it looks like the letter T. And this goes into your like waistcoat pocket or your coat pocket, like so. It goes in like that, crossways, and then it goes upways like that to stop it from falling out. Now, this type did originally have a military leather one in many, many different colours, but obviously the user who has purchased this last replaced it with a more durable and more wear and tear resistant metal one. I'm not sure if this is silver or steel or whatever. I'm sure it's probably just pewter metal, but anyway. The First World War happened, and pocket watches kind of became obsolete during the First World War because officers, timekeeping for them was extremely important because they had to time to the minute when they were going to go over the top, when an attack was going to happen, what actions they were going to do, etc., etc. And these were really awkward with the 1902 patent officer's tunic, which, even though officers did get them tailor-made to fit their proportions, they were still very awkward and very difficult to get out of a pocket. So what officers started doing is they started mounting them on their wrist, basically, to basically just the flick of a wrist and they could tell the time, rather than having to open a pocket, pull out the watch, put it back in, etc., etc. It was less actions to do a function, basically. And they became so popular after the war that many soldiers purchased them privately. Many, many companies made them in many styles and such. And the watches from the 1920s and watches that are still being found today or still being sold from the First World War are basic examples of what modern modern wristwatches become to be, except the face has changed because eyesight and such is different. But I will show you an example of a modern equivalent of a wristwatch. This is a digital watch. This is a Casio. Just focus on that, sorry. This is a Casio wristwatch, or commonly known as the R19, I think. But this is a comparison between the two modern watches. This is how different they are. So basically, one you pull out of a pocket to tell the time, and one you can wear on your wrist and basically just flick your wrist and you can tell the time. And yes, these are both in sync. Unfortunately, this is out by a few seconds, I think, and I have used this quite a lot, basically. This is a really damn good wristwatch. This is basically a bargain basement wristwatch, but it's really, really good. highly recommend if you want to get into wristwatches. This is a great starter. They're really cheap. Anyway, so getting back to the pocket watch. The pocket watch kind of became obsolete during the Second World War. After the First World War, it wasn't really seen. You did occasionally see officers using them because obviously officers were paid more money by regular infantry, but regular infantry did occasionally still use these pocket watches. Now, this is an example from the Second World War, and it is known as a General Service timepiece. There you go. And that below is the service number and the broad arrow to represent that this was used by the British Army, or it was sold by the British Army. Now, the service number means that this was actually in service, and this was bought by a soldier, and this would be registered in his army payroll book that he had purchased this watch, or purchased the watch while in service. And these were built during the interwar years, during the 1920s and 1930s, most commonly during the 30s. And when the army modernised, these were kind of obsolete, although certain officers did actually use them. Famously, General George S. Patton used a pocket watch, and Winston Churchill used, I think it was called a Dubé or Bouquet, something or other. Anyway, it was a belt, I think it was a British-made or a European-made pocket watch that was nicknamed the Turnip by his family, and it was commissioned by the 7th Duke of Marlborough, who was Winston Churchill's great-grandfather, that he inherited it from. And there are pictures and examples of this online. You can go and Google them. It's a very, very interesting pocket watch for a Prime Minister who still used them. Pocket watches were still used after the 19th century and the First World War, but unfortunately, they were only used by either people who could afford them, who were very rich, or upper-class elderly gentlemen. Women still use pocket watches all the way through the 19th and 20th century, and even nurses to this day in medical care still use a example of the pocket watch, except it's more of a brooch pocket watch, which is kind of how women used to use them, or they used to keep it in their purse. And it was more of an open face design like this, but a bit bulkier. I do have an example of a woman's pocket watch, but it's from the 1960s, inherited from my grandmother, but it's in the watch shop being repaired, and I've yet to collect it. But anyway, yeah, this was issued during the Second World War, and I've yet to look up serial number, and also finding Second World War period, Second World War era serial numbers or latter is very difficult to find unless you go to military museums or military archives to look them up, which I don't have access to currently. But as you can see under the second hand, even after 75 years, it's still keeping time. It says Swiss made, and I think that that's actually paint around the seconds bit, but this is what's called an Arabic design on the front, so the embossed 12-3, unfortunately the 6 is covered by the seconds and the 9. It's made by a company called DAMAS, which is a Swiss watch company, which is a company that's still going to this day. A lot of the watches were different depending on the make, so a Jaeger watch, which is another Swiss watch company. All these watches were made by Swiss watch companies. The British Army had these commissioned by Swiss watch companies. They were made by Damas, which is this one. They were made by Jaeger, which had a black face and like green hands. Omega and Rolex, all different Swiss watch companies made watches for the British Army. But unfortunately, these weren't shock resistant because, as you can see, there's an indent on the back of this case. They weren't shock resistant, but many German pocket watches, however, that were made by Swiss watchmakers were shock resistant. No idea why the British Army didn't make these shock resistant. I can't tell you that because I don't know, honestly. But also, these on the hands are illuminating strips. These aren't radioactive. They're like some kind of a luminous, like lacquering or something, but during the night, if you wanted to tell the time at night time, these would light up, and these would basically give you the time to show you what it was, essentially. Now, I do have an example of a pocket watch that not a pocket watch, a wristwatch, that does exactly that. This is a Eagle Moss copy of a 1950s Soviet Airman's pocket watch. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to get rid of the strap show the back. Unfortunately, it does say on the back it's marketed as a 1950s astronaut watch, the same one worn by Yuri Gagayev, I think his name is, the first Russian man to go into space. That's wrong. This is a copy of a 1950s Russian Air Force watch. It's basically identical, or kind of identical to this, with embossed lettering and the seconds. And if I show you down below, you might not be able to see that, but it does have a luminous strip, light luminous coating on the hand, so it can tell the time in the dark. Probably can't see that, but anyway. Obviously, these were actually used. These used to use uranium as the coating because uranium was luminous during the dark. In the dark, but thank goodness, because of modern reproductions, this basically just uses a modern safe equivalent. This is a quartz movement. It's basically, yeah, precision quartz movement. It's basically a modern reproduction of that. And as well, if you can find these very cheap online, Eagle Moss did a massive collection of like military pocket watches and stuff. The Japanese officer one looks really nice, but the rest are kind of naff, I think. You can pick these up in surplus stores. They're not very difficult to find. They're not that uncommon. But yeah. So yeah, this pocket watch is from the Second World War, and it was issued. And you don't really see a lot of examples of pocket watches during the Second World War because they weren't really practical. They weren't really useful in frontline situations because it's not very easy in the heat of combat to pull this out of your pocket. Although, regardless of that, it's a very, very nice pocket watch, I've got to admit. I was quite surprised that it was going... I will say how much I paid for this. I paid £60 for this. 60 Great British pounds. They're not... That's expensive, granted. But in retrospective, that's pretty cheap for a pocket watch, because most pocket watches are going for double that, if not triple that. And this is probably like a brass one, It's been dented and scratched, granted, but it's still going strong. I mean, obviously you can see in the light there, the case has a lot of scratches on it, but it's still a beautiful piece of history, and you don't see these often, and if you do see them, highly recommend picking them up. They're really, really fascinating, but there's not a lot of information on these, unfortunately. There's like some info on who they were made by, and if you can find the person who these were issued to, by the service number or something, and if somebody can Google that service number and find out who made it, that would be absolutely amazing. And I'm just going to set the camera down, apologies, and I'm going to take the back off. I'm not sure how this is going to work. I'm not sure how... here we go. The back's a bit finicky to get off. But I don't think I'm trying to show you the movement. I don't think that will be possible, because the movement itself is really, really interesting. I don't think I'm going to be able to do that, unfortunately. Here we go. There's like most pocket watches, there's a section at the top. Probably can't see that, but there's a section at the top that's so indented that you can stick a knife in it and pry it open, if that's going to be possible. I don't think that's going to be possible. Or I think it's a twist movement. I'm not exactly... here we go. Oh no. That was me turning the spring there. Yeah, it does twist, but I can't seem to get it off, unfortunately. Here we go. Right. You can see the movement ticking away quite nicely. It even has DAMAS on the main cog. That's the mainspring there, or the second spring, and it has some writing in there. That's upside down. I don't know if you can see that, but it says 15 joules free adjust, Swiss made. So that is the movement, ticking away quite nicely. It's a very, very well-kept pocket watch. And honestly, I'm quite surprised that this is, for the age it is, it's still in decent condition. I'm actually quite surprised about that. Apologies for moving the camera a bit closer. But yeah, that's the movement, ticking away quite nicely. And that is the back. That's the serial number again and the general service timepiece. And it has in the back a few inscriptions and fingerprints and such, and it has I think that's the watch serial number, and it has an inscription in the back there. I think that's the name of the person. I don't know. I haven't exactly been able to decipher what that means, but those are 75-year-old fingerprints in there from the last person who used this pocket watch. That's very, very interesting, and a fascinating piece of history. So, I really hope you enjoyed looking at this pocket watch and me talking about it. If you did, please be sure to like and subscribe for more content like this in the future, if you so wish. Be sure to comment down below the video and tell me what kind of videos you want me to make, because I'm still busy and I will get around to making video content at some point. Or if you have ideas you want me to talk about, then please feel free to do so. And also feel free to share the video with people if you did find it interesting. I think they'll find it interesting because, again, this is a very interesting little piece of history. And again, it's pocket litter in historical terms. So if you are reenacting or doing a living history interpretation of a British soldier, this is quite an interesting, pardon the pun, timepiece to show to people. Because again, pocket watches are fairly uncommon during the Second World War, but they did exist. In limited quantities, granted, but they did exist. Oh, another thing to add just before I end the video. There are examples of these with Commonwealth markings, although as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence or no pictures online of them with Commonwealth markings on the back. The broad arrow on the back is to represent this was made by the British Army, and there are examples of Commonwealth markings on this exact pocket watch, but unfortunately, I'm not sure there's any evidence of them ever being used by the Commonwealth. There will have been, obviously, but there's no physical examples. And also, as well, a last thing, you do get some examples that say S and then say the company Brettlings on the bottom. S means sold out of service, so after the Second World War, when soldiers were demobbed, they would give these pocket watches back if they didn't need them or didn't use them. And they were sold by a company called Brettlings out of Birmingham. I think, feel free to correct me I'm saying that a lot, but I'm just going off what I've researched for this video. But they were sold by Brettlings in Birmingham by the hundreds, and many people purchased them, and they weren't sold for much because even though they're a Swiss-made pocket watch, nowadays they're not really that cheap. They're not that expensive, but they're not cheap either. But back then they would have gone for not a lot of money because it's a pocket watch, and the end of the day, pocket watches back then were kind of obsolete and not really being used. The wristwatch was far more popular and far more interesting and sophisticated and much basically better in every way than the pocket watch. It was more efficient and easier, more user-friendly. But these were sold, and these were sold out of service, and you do get the occasional one that says S and it says Brettlings Birmingham underneath to say this was sold out of service. They are pretty common. This, however, with the actual service issue on the back and no other markings other than the broad arrowhead and the service number, is extremely rare, in my opinion. But anyway, do all the things I said before, and I do hope you enjoyed the video, and I do hope you stick around for more content like this and others in the future. So until next time, take care and goodbye.